Welcome back, guys. It's that time again. We are here with Yanks on the call for our Dominaria United limited set review. Yanks, how are you doing?
Good. Ready for a new set. We actually had some time between sets for the first time in pretty much forever.
And by that, you mean because you refused to acknowledge the existence of the Baldur's Gate set?
Well, multiple reasons. It's not a premiere set, even for people that like it isn't.
Yeah.
But yes, it's also not Magic in any form, and people that play that should go play Hearthstone.
For limited, it was released just like a normal set on Arena, so it, for me, didn't necessarily feel like we had a ton of time in between sets, but for a constructed standpoint, we definitely did, and that is definitely the case.
And for any paper players.
Well, paper for constructed. Limited players, I think Baldur's Gate was still seeing a ton of limited play in the in stores.
Oh, sure. You're right. I forgot that there was, because those are actually two different sets, right? The Baldur's Gate versus Baldur's Gate Alchemy. I forgot that they actually released a paper version.
Yeah, and it was like Gen Con and a lot of the Command Fests were all about that set as far as limited went. It did get sort of ran out a little bit quicker just because of Double Masters, but it was kind of the premier draftable set. Like, there were no Capenna firing forever.
Oh, that's for sure.
So it didn't feel, from a limited perspective, like there was a ton of time in between, but I am definitely glad to be back here in a premiere set for Standard.
Yeah, I actually kind of forgot, but I really enjoyed Double Masters draft, but it's always nice and different to see new cards as opposed to just pure reprints.
Definitely true, and what a time to be coming back into a premiere set with Dominaria United. Historically, Dominaria has been a great set for both gameplay, lore, everything. It is by far one of my favorites that we have had for a limited environment in the last few years. What about you, Yanks?
Yeah, Dominaria was my favorite limited set since Khans of Tarkir, and I don't think anything after Dominaria has come even close to it. And I say that despite the fact I didn't do very well in the set, but I still enjoyed it, which is not normal. Like, if I struggle in a set, I typically don't enjoy it, but this one, even though I wasn't one of my best sets, I still really enjoyed the format.
Same. One of the things I liked the most about the original Dominaria is that the set didn't feel too complex, but it still felt like I didn't get sick of the gameplay, which is an awesome feeling.
Yeah, it was, you had some good new mechanics that they introduced, some of which we'll see back again, and it played very well. It was not like Streets of New Capenna, for example, felt good when it started, but the gameplay felt very repetitive, and this just didn't really feel that way in Dominaria.
All right, so let's go ahead and jump in. The first thing we want to talk about the new Dominaria United set is that there is a massive lineup for returning characters. Braids is going to be one of the headliners. We've got Karn, Sheldred, Jaya, Squee, Ajani, and holy smokes, there is just a ton more, right? That are like not necessarily premier characters, but characters we've seen throughout Magic's storylines.
Yeah, with still 1 day worth of cards to be spoiled, I counted 21 returning characters just that have cards in the set, not even including some that are in the story, like Teferi that does not have a card. And we just ran off a whole bunch of premier characters without even mentioning Liliana and Liliana the Veil being back.
Yeah, Liliana, Squee, even some smaller ones like Squee, Raph, Rada. Like, there is so many, and they look sweet.
What I think is cool is their characters that are returning from all sorts of different points in Magic's history. You have newer characters like Raph and Danitha that came back from the original Dominaria, but you also have things like Rith from original Invasion Blocker, Solkanar, the original Solkanar, the Swamp King, Zur from Zur the Enchanter, much older cards, Namada, which was a character in Plane Shift, Sheldred from New Phyrexia. It's kind of all over the place where they come from as they're all kind of congregating here on Dominaria.
And they've done a couple of massive things with the storyline. This is just an introduction video, so we're not going to go too deep, but I do know, like, Squee lost his immortality, but then, like, was able to come back anyway, but has lost the immortality ability. And then another big storyline that the internet kind of lost its mind over is Ajani got completed, just like Tamiyo. We're not really surprised that another character got completed, but I think, as a whole, Ajani's, like, team good guy. You know, he's dad of the year, even though he's not a dad. And it's really sad and broke a lot of people's hearts that he was completed.
Yeah, I would say I was mildly surprised. I guess I just knew somebody was going to, and I didn't have any real thought as to who it was going to be. So to me, it could have been kind of anybody. But yeah, Johnny would not have been my first pick for sure.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and jump straight into returning mechanics. We'll go over new mechanics, color pairs, and also some cycles for you guys as well. So we're going to go ahead and start with the 2 returning mechanics, and one of them is kicker. One of the unique things about the kicker in this format is that none of the cards have the same mana cost as the color of the card for their kicker cost. So this is going to be putting you into specific color pairings, which is really interesting. So first we're looking at timely interference. We're not going to go too much into set reviews. If you guys are new here, the following videos to this will be a video for every single color pairing. Every single color, multicolor, and colorless set reviews where we go over every single card on a scale of 1 to 5 for limited gameplay. But this is just kind of an introduction to show you guys what you will expect with the limited environment. So kicker here, like I said, it has a blue mana cost and a red kicker cost. And the combination of the two things kind of combines to show you what these 2 color pairings would do.
Yeah, one thing I actually kind of just thought of that I find really interesting is that both of our returning mechanics, kicker in this case, and we'll see domain next, originated in Invasion. And storyline for this is kind of the second Phyrexian invasion is the storyline here. But also, Invasion was the first ever, at least that Wizards announced as a multicolor set. Actually, the whole block was multicolor focused. And what's interesting is these kicker costs, multicolor kicker was introduced in that. You see that pushing you towards multicolor here, and the set symbol is actually, for any older players, looks very similar to the old Invasion set symbol.
I actually did notice that it reminded me a little bit of the Invasion set symbol, and Invasion is around the time I started playing Magic. So these cards where it has the different kicker color compared to the color of the card is kind of exactly where my beginning point with Magic was. So this whole thing feels very nostalgic to me.
Yeah, and I think that's complemented by the fact that we talked about with all the returning characters. So you see mechanics you've seen before, you've seen themes you've seen before, you see people you've seen before, and planeswalkers you've seen before. I think it's kind of neat that you get this nostalgia feeling again. Remember, we spent the first, I'm not exactly sure, but 10 years or so of Magic only on Dominaria.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So, I wanted to show a second card here with the Tolarian Sorcery. It is another blue kicker card, but you see another pairing, color pairing with it where it has the white kicker cost, but this time it's doing something blue but doing something white in the fact that you get to gain 3 life should you pay that white kicker. So it's pretty interesting change up for the typical kicker cost that we've been seeing lately in the last couple of years, where most of the time it's the same color as the card. And I think it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. The last thing we wanted to touch on for the kicker is that there's actually a sort of unique kicker trait that we haven't seen very often, and that is when you have an and or multi-kicker. So you can actually, multi-kicker is something slightly different, but there are 2 kicker options here. You can pay 1 or both, and they have 2 different color pairings with them, which is very interesting.
Yeah, we've seen this, I believe, once before in Apocalypse. There was a rare cycle, the Volvers, Anavolver, Satavolver, Degavolver, etc., that had multicolor, was a single color casting cost, 2 different enemy color kicker cost, which is what these are as well, at least the ones we've seen so far. The one difference here is that for each of these, each kicker cost does the same thing. It can just happen twice. So like Mindsinger here, if you kick it for 1 in a red, you get 2 counters. If you kick it for 1 in a green, you get 2 counters. If you do both, you get 4 counters. The other one, each color had different effects. So it's just an interesting twist on kicker we don't see very often.
I like that it allows you to be in just 1 or 2 colors. It allows you to splash another one, but if you don't have it, you're not completely punished. So I think that that's pretty neat. I like that it gives you the option and also makes it kind of more difficult if it was, doubling the cost of, if it was like pay 2 colorless and 2 red to get the ability twice. I think it would kind of limit deck building options a little bit more, and I like that this has a lot more flexibility. All right, the next returning mechanic we're going to talk about is Domain. This is, again, one of the mechanics we've seen in the past, but it's interesting that it is not super specific. Domain in this set comes across in many different ways depending on the card that it's played on. Sometimes Domain can lower the cost of a spell, like you see here with Leyline's Binding, or it could actually change what the card does throughout gameplay, as this card does, the Czar, as you get more +1/+1 counters based on the number of lands that you, or types of lands that you control, which is interesting that, like I said, Domain can do multiple different abilities.
Yeah, Domain's an ability word. For like recent examples, think of like Magecraft from Strixhaven, where Magecraft just meant whenever you cast an instant or copy an instant or sorcery spell, do this. Domain just means there's an ability that on the card that cares about the number of different basic land types you control.
I was thinking Alliance was the Capenna one. Is that that what it's called?
Yep.
Yes, something similar to that, where it is just the keyword that deals with lands, but it doesn't necessarily have to do with casting something with those spells, sort of like a Sunburst ability.
Yeah, the very classic Domain card historically that made some waves in Constructed was Tribal Flames, which was 1 in a red that dealt X to something where X was the number of basic land types you control.
Yeah.
With Domain. That was an invasion block staple. Interesting to see it back. Works nicely with those 3 color kicker cards that we just talked about, because that means you probably have 3 different basic land types somewhere around.
All right, we're going to move it to the next returning ability. Is the last returning ability on our list, but also our first new ability. We're going to go ahead and talk about the Sagas. Sagas are coming back. We've seen them a bunch in the recent years, but they originally debuted in the first Dominaria, so it's no surprise to see them here. But what we are seeing that is new is the read ahead mechanic. This is on every single saga in this set, and what it does is it sort of just says that you can start on any chapter that you would like. So it reads, choose a chapter when you play this, and then you just automatically go there. Let's say we want to start on chapter 2, create a white bird token, and then we immediately move to chapter 3, skip chapter 1 altogether, which is definitely pretty unique.
Yeah, read ahead gives you a ton of flexibility. It basically turns this card into 3 different spells, and you get whichever one you need at the time you can get right then. But if you want some of the later abilities, which are generally more powerful, you sacrifice the early ones.
Yeah, and I think it kind of, sometimes you draw a saga that, you need a creature to block, but the creature's on, chapter 2 or 3, and you then just die. But this gives you that flexibility, but then you're ultimately losing some of the initial value on some of these sagas, decreasing their overall power level or effect on that particular game.
And also, and specifically this card that we're seeing here is an interesting design, because I don't think I would ever want to play this card in Limited if I had to play Chapter 1. Because now I'm down a card. I've given them, each of us, 2 cards, but I spent 3 mana to do it, and a card, and they get to go first. But that's a pretty good ability in Commander, because you get to just pick one of the other players at the table. But with Read Ahead, you can just play it and skip that first one.
Yep, and you usually pick the player that has the weakest thing, or that you're aligned with. That makes total sense for EDH. And we see this type of card draw in White a lot. It's gotten much better with some of the creatures that has been drawing cards with White recently. But typically, White does say you and your opponent both draw, and it ends up being worse because it's card disadvantage for you because you draw less cards because you've spent a card to do it, and then also your opponent then gets to untap with those cards where you have spent your mana. So typically, this is exactly what we would expect to see with White, and it's almost never playable as far as card draw in Limited. So you're right. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 here is exactly what we want to be doing, so it isn't really a huge loss to be missing a chapter.
Yeah, I think Read Ahead just opens up some interesting saga design space for the developers.
Yeah, I'm thinking about past sagas that we've seen, and I feel like most often you don't want to skip a saga because 1, 2, and 3 all add up to be a good value card. Whereas if you just go straight to Chapter 3, oftentimes it's almost not worth playing.
Yeah, the only interesting one, I'm trying to think of the name of it. There was one saga I remember where Chapter 2 did nothing remotely relevant.
Yeah.
But you wanted 1 and 3, so that doesn't help here. So yeah. You can't skip 2.
Sometimes that happens with random red sagas, I think.
Yeah, and some of them are more constructed plants that just don't do any, like one of the abilities is great and constructed but doesn't do anything limited.
Okay, so now that was, again, the last returning first new mechanic. We're going to go ahead and move on to Enlist. Enlist is an interesting mechanic. A lot of people are saying it's basically fixed banding without like difficult rules. So all it is that when it attacks, you can tap a non-summoning sick creature to add its power to the attacking creature. So this 2/1 for 2 can attack as a 4/2 if you tap a non-summoning sick 2/2 to go with it. And then it has other abilities with it sometimes, but that's honestly not the point of this particular segment. What do you think of Enlist, Yanks?
I think anybody that's listened to our videos will be unsurprised to find out that this is not my favorite mechanic because it involves having way too many creatures on the board. But just in general, I think this mechanic is going to play pretty well online. I think in paper it's going to be interesting as for at least the first few weeks, everyone tries to tap summoning sick creatures for this.
Yeah, because we have abilities like this, like let's say as recent as Capenna, where we had, what was the civil servant cat, where, you tap another citizen, and it did get +1/+0 and lifelink, and that creature can have summoning sickness. Yeah. Crewing vehicles, those creatures can have summoning sickness. It doesn't make a ton of sense to me that we would need them to not be summoning sick. I guess the story behind it is that creature is joining you in the attack, which it can only do if it's not summoning sick. But at that point, I don't know.
Yeah, it just goes against like kind of a long embedded instinct that tapping a creature to pay another cost doesn't get affected by haste or by summoning sickness.
Also, it only affects the power, so it just makes this blocked by a 2/2. At that point, wouldn't I rather just attack with 2/2/2s? I think it would be relevant if you've got Enlist characters that have flying, or I think Enlists could be mounted things like horses or birds. That would be kind of sweet, but like in this particular situation, it seems pretty medium.
Yeah, I think you're going to be looking for flying. You're going to be looking for first strike. You're looking for trample. Those are probably the three big ones. I'm curious to see if there's any Enlist Death Touchers because that would be really dumb. But
yeah, I agree with that. Okay, well, Enlist Death Touchers, they would still block the same.
Yeah, it's just like more like why would you ever tap something to pump your Death Toucher when attacking?
I can agree with that.
I don't think that I haven't seen one, and I believe Enlist is only in red, white, or green, so unless you get like a green snake that has it, you probably won't see it.
Enlist would be insane if it also adopted the character that taps abilities. That'd be sick.
Yeah.
All right, let's go ahead and move on, guys, to the last new mechanic. This is an interesting one, actually, stun counters. So now we're sort of getting like this almost like Hearthstone-y vibe where your characters are sort of like, I don't know, adding multiple counters feels like a board game type deal where you like remove the counters. We see stuff like that on a lot of maybe enchantments, or you remove lore counters, things like that. But this is the first time I'm really seeing add 3 stun counters to a creature. If the creature would untap, you can remove a stun counter. So this card essentially keeps it locked down for 3 turns.
Yeah, I mean, you are right. Like, counters are very much these type of counters and ability counters are very much a product of digital design where it's easy to track them.
Yeah.
Like trying to keep track of 4 or 5 different types of counters on something in paper, like there's a reason they never historically, I still think they don't put +1/+1 and -1/-1 counters in the same sets. So they don't overlap to confuse people. They try to avoid too many other types of counters, like charge counters and things. Historically, they've tried to limit that because it just, you tend to use like little marbles or little coins or little things to track them, or dice for power counters and stuff like that. And it just gets kind of messy in paper.
Yeah. Digital design has changed a lot. Now, that said, I still think, like, I saw the Capenna packs had shield tokens. They had little, card size things where you could pop out +1/+1 counters, shield counters, and things like that. So they are starting to try to supply you with the tools you need to make this stuff work. I think it's an interesting thing. If you put a creature with a +1/+1 counter, you put this on top of that, and then you've got 3 counters. You have to use a different dice, one for stun, one for... It's a little awkward.
Yeah, and I think it's good idea that they do those counters. They make them. At the same time, I can't trust my opponent to have dice, pen, or paper with them. So thinking they're going to remember their counters is pretty unlikely.
Yeah, and we're gonna end up ripping up pieces of our event slip to make those. I do that stuff all the time.
You'd have match slips that looked like people took bites out of them.
Yes, absolutely. The last two things we wanted to talk about as far as the specific set stuff is the cycle cards. There are two very specific cycle cards. The first one of them being 2-mana lords. Now there is a lord for all the different colors. We have soldiers, merfolk, goblins, elves, and clerics. And then the green one here, as you guys can see, 2-mana 1/1 that pumps elves and does some other elf-like abilities. And then the same thing can be said about the goblins, the clerics, the merfolk. So what do you think of these lords, Yanks?
I mean, lords are a tradition in Magic ever since, Alpha. You had Goblin King and Zombie Master, and I'm blanking on what the name of the merfolk, Lord of Atlantis. So I like seeing them. I think, they're rares. They don't affect limited gameplay that much, and trying to get a critical mass of the right creature type can be tricky, but I think these cards, Tribal is always a favorite among casual players. This card, I think, could be pretty terrifying in Legacy Elves.
Yeah.
Deck already draws 12 billion cards by recurring Elvish Visionaries and Glimpsing, so having another one is pretty good, but this one could also go in a modern deck.
The goblins were also talking about seeing some Legacy play, right?
Yeah.
These are actually quite powerful.
And I think the Merfolk one is legit, too. I mean, Merfolk has been sort of a off-the-wall pick for Vintage for a long time, and would not surprise me if that maybe made a little bit of a comeback, because that card is really good too.
To find a tribal card that makes it into Legacy at this point, because they've been printing elves and goblins for years and years and years, and for an elf or goblin to make the cut into those decks, now we don't know that they will yet, but this is the first time we've seen people really hyped about these cards in a Legacy environment in a very long time. So it just goes to show you how powerful these lords actually are. Now that doesn't necessarily they'll be good in Standard, because the rest of the elves have to be there. We know they're there in Legacy. We don't necessarily know that they're going to be here, and this is the first set post-rotation. So this is the smallest set we're going to see. This will be the smallest the field will be. So these elves might not do anything right away, but who knows? Maybe we'll get a ton more support to see some more tribal decks in Standard.
The one I would keep an eye out for, not right away, but as we move through the next handful of sets, is the Merfolk one. Because we're going back to Ixalan, and specifically Ixalan Underwater has been talked about for that. So there's going to be plenty of Merfolk. And Eldraine, which also had Merfolk. So we have two sets that are coming up that have Merfolk.
Yeah, Eldraine had knights and not soldiers, so that is kind of out for the soldier guy. One of the things, I have to look at the list. I don't know, we currently have a Standards Clerics list that's kind of dope, but I think a good chunk of that is rotating, so it depends what is left behind. But I could see that seeing some Standard play. All right, the second one that we're going to talk about, guys, is the Defiler cycle. The Defiler cycle is actually really interesting. So there is one of these Defilers in every single color, and basically what they do is they turn the mana cost, their color, into Phyrexian mana. So for example, the Defiler of Vigor makes all of your green mana spells now cost green Phyrexian mana. So instead, you can cast them for 1 or 2 less, depending if you want to spend the life, and then they usually do something upon playing those cards. For example, whenever you play a blue spell, you draw a card. Whenever you play a green spell, you get a +1/+1 counter on all your creatures. So it's making them cheaper to cast while also doing stuff. And with blue, for example, you could chain into your spells and cast multiple spells because you're casting them for cheaper and redrawing, which just absolutely seems pretty nutty. And to boot, they're all 6/6 tramplers for 5 mana. What the heck?
Couple interesting things with the Defiler cycle. First of all, the ability is a May, so it doesn't force you to pay Phyrexian mana. It doesn't force you to pay life. It allows you just to play your spells the normal way. It affects permanents only, so it doesn't let you chain like a million card drawing spells in the blue one. It does let you chain blue permanents, which when they enter, lets you then draw a card, so it kind of functions that way, but it's only permanent spells, which is an interesting restriction they put on this. And I'm just curious to see how this plays out. Phyrexian mana has always historically been kind of dangerous.
Yeah.
Now, one thing these don't do necessarily is do all the color fixing and color shifting that Phyrexian mana spells do. Like, one of the problems with historically with things like Dismember is that you get to play a good removal spell in your mono white deck or your mono blue deck that doesn't have access to it normally. This, you need to have played a double green spell to get this effect. So you have to legitimately be in that color. So that does mitigate some of the problems with Phyrexian mana.
I just want to note that you literally just stole the one good thing I had to say about Phyrexian mana when we did this, like, in a trial run. So, yeah, that's not appreciated.
I was trying to put it in a different way than what we talked about. I was trying to fix the problems of it.
I was saying in Limited, the thing I usually like about Phyrexian mana is that it does allow me to cast things in weird, like Tezzeret's Gambit in Limited the last time we saw it. I was just like, I'm literally just going to throw this into every single deck ever. So yeah, it doesn't fix that, which is a little bit of a bummer. But that said, I'm glad also because, this does enough. Thanks, Hammy.
He agrees.
He does agree, actually. I think that was the last of the cycle cards that we wanted to talk about. It's busted. I think the Lords and the Defilers are pretty powerful, and I expect to see a lot of them. Oh, one last thing I did want to say about this Defiler. They're rares, not mythics.
Yeah, they're very good. They're rare, so they don't show up all the time in Limited, but they can be pretty scary, especially this one, I think. I think the blue one's scarier for constructed potential, I think, but this one's pretty terrifying in Limited.
Yeah. I mean, a 5-mana 6/6 Trampler, I'm not going to be happy to see in Limited anyway. And then it just does some other stuff. It's going to be tough.
Colossal Dreadmaw has gotten so much better.
He costs one more, though, right?
Exactly. He got way better. So what happens when you complete Colossal Dreadmaw? You get Defiler of Vigor.
Oh, holy crap. Okay, he's a Phyrexian worm. He's sweet.
Yeah.
All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the color pairings. I will say that they were quite liberal with their multicolor cards here. This is what we're going to wrap up the episode on, or the show here, is that all 10 of the color pairings are seen. There is a large number of multicolor creatures. In general, they're literally all legendary. I think we counted like 46 legendary creatures in the set, and all of the multicolors 100% are all legendary, which is absolutely nutty to me.
Yeah, I think as of when we're recording this, with 1 day's worth of spoilers left, there were 34 gold cards, and they were all legendaries. 33 creatures plus a Johnny.
Yeah. That is, and Planeswalkers are legendary, so that holds true. So the last thing we were going to bring up was just kind of go over the Mark Rosewater article a little bit, where he tells us about the color pairings and what they kind of represent. Most of them are pretty straightforward. If you guys are veterans of the game, you'll, be like, yep, that's the definition of Boros. That makes sense. But there were a few curveballs in there, so let's just go down the list. White-blue. This is a combination go wide with instants and sorceries. And focuses on tokens and protecting them. Not anything too surprising there. What do you think?
Actually, to me, this is probably the one that's the most surprising, just because I do not think of tokens when I think white-blue. I do think tempo. I do think flyers, but that's not usually the deck I want to play, like my... I know it's a red card, but like my Trumpet Blast type effects. And that seems like kind of what this is going to be rewarding.
Yeah, I will say, like, I've seen, like, white-blue go-wides, but they're not usually with tokens. But given that, I feel like the sort of breakdown that he did here is just, like, white's associated with tokens, blue's associated with this, and then just kind of smashed them together into a two-sentence. So it could just be that both of these creatures or colors are moderately creature-heavy, and white just tends to have more tokens than normal, is what we might see. But we'll have to see how it plays out. I am really surprised to see the word tokens in blue-white.
Yeah, I mean, even Maro mentioned that in his thing about white-blue, that this is kind of novel space for that color pair. I think
All
that
right.
was the only one he says that for.
All right, blue-black is a combination of instant and sorceries and death. Surprise, surprise. You have a control deck that uses card advantage and slowly eke out a victory. Blue-black control? That is exactly what I would expect to see.
I'm smiling. This is what I like.
Nobody likes you, Yanks. Go home. Go eat worms.
I've accepted this.
Black-red. This is a combination of death and aggression. Black-red? No, that I could never see that. It results in an aggressive creature strategy where you're rewarded with having your creatures die. Okay. Red-black sacrifice. We haven't seen that be outrageous and limited recently.
So I was about to say, that's the one word that doesn't show up in this description that I might expect, is the word sacrifice.
Well, it does say rewarded for having your creatures die, which to me just says sacrifice.
See, normally I would agree with you. I think this is very much more just of a death trigger, as opposed to, like, we'll see later, white-black discusses sacrificing. Now, the black portion may be where you're getting the sacrifice from, and it might show up in both pairs. But
yeah, anytime
I think it's interesting he didn't specify that. That's
true. But anytime I find that I want my stuff to die, I end up finding sacrifice targets, sacrifice outlets for them. Yeah. Red-green, this is a combination of aggression and ramp. I kind of feel like we just kind of copy-pasted this from like the generic wiki, the magic wiki, where it like breaks down what Boros and Gruul is basically. This is a mid-range creature deck that makes the use of domain cards, which it's interesting to see that this is where the domain is. Yeah,
I think, unsurprisingly, you're going to see some amount of domain probably in every green deck. It's the color that's easiest to splash in, that wants to get you to 4 or 5 colors sometime in a lot of formats. But yeah, this is mostly your basic rule aggro.
Green-white. This is the combination of domain and go wide. We always see Selesnya get a lot of creatures. This deck splashes extra colors to use domain as a tool to reinforce your attacking army. Not anything I wouldn't expect to see.
Nope. One thing we actually were spoiled today that's going to reinforce all these domain cards is the common land dual land cycle all have land types.
I did see that. Let's move on to black-white. This is go wide plus death. I feel like they just put go wide in any time it said white.
Yeah,
right?
Domain every time it says green, and death for black.
So pretty straightforward definitions here, but we're committed. We're halfway through, so we're going to keep it going. So go white plus death, which means the deck is about creating a lot of small creatures and then sacrificing them for value. It ends up being a slower controlling deck, more controlling than most go wide synergies. Which is fair if it's a lot of like 1/1s or a lot of things that, drain when it dies or something like that.
Yeah, this is your classic aristocrats style deck. Sacrifice things, drain, blood artist type effects. We see this fairly often.
Blue-red. This combines instants and sorceries with aggression and leads to tempo-based spells deck. That's one of my favorite decks to play in Limited. Sometimes they're excellent and sometimes they're pretty poopy. I'm excited to see what this one is.
Yeah, blue-red is almost always a spells deck. It's just whether or not it's a tempo-aggressive spells deck or a controlling spells deck. This sounds like you're leaning more towards the tempo side.
Certainly true. Black-green, this combines death and ramp. This results in a mid-range deck that makes use of the graveyard. Very common for Golgari as well. Red-white, This combines aggression with go-wide results in a typically aggro creature-based strategy. Red-white. Red-white's bread and butter, he says.
Yep, Boros does what Boros does.
I like Boros. That's my happy place. Let's go with the last one, which is green-blue, a little Simic action. This combines ramp and domain with instants and sorceries. It results in a base green-blue deck that splashes 2 or 3 colors to make use of big domain effects. So, not anything really here that I wasn't expecting as far as the color wheel goes. Everything seemed pretty straightforward to me.
Yeah, I think blue-white is the only one that surprised me at all. Everything else kind of seems like what you expect. Green-blue is... Simic is sometimes just like, you're not really sure what it's doing. I think more recently they've really focused on this sort of ramp being blue-green as opposed to maybe some other green decks. This feels a lot like a Quandrix type deck.
I'm wondering if the blue-white, the reason it said tokens there where it didn't say it in green, I'm wondering if we're going to see a lot of mechanics, a lot of blue cards, because we've recently gotten a few that says create a token of a card that you currently control. And I'm wondering if like maybe there's a few of those splashed in here that we don't normally see, just to kind of make it the white go wide with more token generation amongst those two colors than any other two colors.
Yeah, for sure. I'm taking a quick look at blue from what we've seen so far, and I see a couple things that make tokens, but not a ton.
But that's still more than usual, right?
Actually, I guess only one, but there are still some cards not spoiled, so.
Fair. All right, guys, I think that wraps up our introduction video. We went a little bit longer than we normally do. Thank you guys very, very much for joining us. And tomorrow, you guys can see the white card review that Yanks and I will be posting up. Yanks, thanks for joining us.
Anytime. Excited for Dominaria United.
See you guys in tomorrow's white set review. Bye. I'd like to end this video with a special thank you to those of you guys who have signed up for my Patreon. Without my wonderful patrons, none of this content would be possible. If you'd like to support this content and get your name up on the Wall of Fame, you can sign up for our Patreon by using the link down below in the description. Another way you can support the channel is by using code MNG5 with Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find cool stuff in stock. They have everything you need for Magic, board games, and any of your other nerdy hobbies.